Hi, welcome to my little introduction to the PSPDNA interpreter. PSPDNA interpreter is an interpreter written in C and was originally based on a project called .NET Anywhere, which was written by a guy called Chris Bacon, who wrote a small interpreter to run on an embedded device. He also cross-compiled and ran on Windows, but I think his main purpose originally was to run it on an embedded device that he had. So essentially what I have done is I've taken his interpreter, ported over many of the changes that other people have made, and have made it so that it basically runs modern C# code within a reason, because his interpreter doesn't do everything. My interpreter is reasonably similar to his, and so if you've ever looked at his interpreter, you'll probably be able to understand what's going on. The main difference is that I changed the standard library so that it has PSP namespaces in it. The reason for this will become obvious later. And I have obviously implemented the pieces of additional code necessary to make the code run on the PSP natively. So his original project is over here. As you can see, it's moribund. It hasn't been updated very much in the last 10 years. A few things have been changed in the last 2 years. I believe he did a talk and he had a separate little mini interpreter that he created a couple of years ago, but not an awful lot has been done with it recently. The most notable thing was that he wrote a little snake game and implemented free type support in his. I have some font support in my interpreter. I haven't ported his snake game over. That's something that I'm hoping to do in the near future. It was also used as the basis of the first version of Blazor. It's not used anymore. It was used more or less as a sort of proof of concept to get .NET code compiled for WebAssembly. But yeah, Blazor was the project that sort of brought DNA back into notoriety, and the code that I have has got some bits of that repository in it because they were quite useful. So what we have essentially is I have a minimalist PSP SDK version compiled for both Windows and Mac OS X. This is a little bit out of date. It says I'm currently mainly working under Catalina. I'm not anymore. I'm working under Big Sur. So I'm using Visual Studio Mac 2019 and Visual Studio Code. It's just the simplest way to get it to work for me. Yeah, and the main changes are that I've added a PSP namespace. This is because the way the interpreter works is that I would normally have used pinvoke as you would in a normal .NET environment to add additional APIs in and call native code. Except PSP doesn't allow you to have that. You can only call code within the same executable, from what I understand. So there's a way of doing that, but it has to be compiled into the main runtime. And because it has to be compiled into the main runtime, I didn't see the point of having a calllib that was separate in sort of like had lots of different libraries. So at the moment, there's one big namespace. All of the additional things for the PSP namespace are within the calllib. And so if you look at my calllib, there's a PSP directory and all of this stuff here is specific to PSP. This namespace is in calllib, so when you compile code using my library, you will be able to access all of the stuff that's in here. At the moment, there are really basically hardly anything implemented. I mean, there's some kernel functions that I needed to start things up. Some of the debug code is in there so you can debug right to the window. Got implementation of the controls. Got a class that represents color and converts between the namespace, the color spaces that the PSP uses and the color spaces that are easy to use within the .NET framework. And we've got two different versions. There's the graphics routines. Basic graphics was the first one I did, and it's kind of based on some example code. Not being a PSP programmer, I don't know an awful lot yet about PSP and how everything works with regards to the way you set graphics up and stuff. So I was basically using one of the tutorials that was online. And the performance was a bit suboptimal, to be honest. So I've instead got a second one now, which, to be honest, for all intents and purposes, is almost a drop-in replacement. And that second one allows me to basically do everything I could do with the other one, but also it includes all of the routines rewritten using SDL2, which gives us a lot more ability to do things in the future, I think. I'm not entirely happy about using SDL. I think probably it would be better not to use SDL and use the native libraries, but I haven't learned them well enough yet. So I think that's holding me back, and I wanted to get something working. The actual code, if we look at the native code, is quite extensive. There's a lot in here. The main meat of it is that you have to implement routines that represent all of the native functions that you're calling from the C# code. So, for example, if we look at basic graphics2.c, you'll see it's basically just implementing it in a standard way using SDL and such. The only weird thing is that all of the functions get sort of given a pointer to a pointer to the parameters, and a pointer to the return value, and also have this async call return type. So, I mean, it took a little while for me to get my head around it when I first started looking at it. But if you look at the DNA code, Chris has implemented quite an easy way of accessing these things and converting them to the correct types. It's just a case of you looking at them, working out how it was done previously, and kind of doing your best to kind of graft that into the actual code that you're writing. It's not particularly hard, but it's also a bit mind-bending to begin with. And then the only other notable thing is when adding a function in, there is, if I can remember where it is, a great hunking routine somewhere. Which has got all of the information about everything in the entire universe. Is it runtime.c? Hang on. It might be easier if I flip to my editor. So probably how to do, there you go, internal call. So internal call basically hooks up in writing the methods based on the class name and namespace, and you basically just specify the native hook and the types. So I think the return, how many parameters it's got, and then the parameters in an array. And you have these types all defined. I think it's just a bunch of constants, defined constants that you can use. So it's fully expandable. You can add more types in if you really wanted to, but I suppose you'd have to understand how the .NET type system works, and it's quite complicated. So this table gets loaded at runtime, and this is basically how all of the native routines call into the C code. So yes. Then if we go to the .NET project, which is separate, there are a couple of demo projects, but the meat of it is basically there's a core lib. The core lib has got, as I said, the PSP specific functions in it, but it's also got all of the .NET stuff in it as well. You do not use the core lib from standard .NET, you use this core lib, and so there's a way of compiling it so that happens. So there's a very simple test project, and a very simple test project literally just, I believe, initializes the graphics and puts some boxes on the screen and allows you to move them around with the keys. And I've also ported an SDL app that comes from a repository, which I've linked at the top. It's from the TinyC repository, which I've opened off the screen. Okay, so I suppose on one of my other windows. There you go. So Tiny C has a bunch of games in it. One of them's called Tet. It's a Tetris clone. And so if you look at this source code, you'll see you've got this kind of layout for all of the things, and you've got a bunch of functions, and it's all C, and it's using SPL. And my version of Tet is basically the same code, ported to C#, and all of the drawing routines have been replaced by the basic graphics drawing routines. So all that's been implemented in basic graphics 2 and basic graphics is what was needed to actually get the basic sort of engine working. So this version is not the version that you saw in GitHub. This version's actually got the text routine implemented. I've only implemented it in basic graphics 2 at the moment because basic graphics 1, obviously using the native functions, I hadn't got my head around how the free type library works yet, and it was pretty easy to implement it. So how do you use this? Well, if you compile this, yeah, so it's built successful. It's not made any changes. It's basically will compile the core lib and also the actual game executable. If we go and look at the properties, I think that's called options, isn't it? Yeah. It's currently building as a .NET 4 framework application, but you could use any of the other .NET outputs. And I believe this is the important thing. If you set do not reference mscorelib.dll, it will allow you to reference your DLL. And my DLL, if I look, is actually one of the dependencies. So the core lib that we use is this core lib. If you don't do this, then it will compile the standard core lib, and then you'll have a lot of problems when you actually run it, because I believe the code will not find the core lib. And also, of course, all of the PSP graphics functions and such don't exist. But the C# code is pretty much standard C# code. The only weird thing is that there are no multi-dimensional arrays, which caused me a bit of a problem. So I had to do something funky with lists or something along those lines. I don't remember exactly what I did off the top of my head. But to get that to work was the only thing that caused me any real problem. And we go back here. I have got this set up so that all of the minimalist SDK for PSP is referenced, although there's some funky stuff where it doesn't find some of the headers, which I'm not really sure why. It does sometimes, it doesn't, and it depends on what computer you're using it on. When I had it on my Catalina computer, pretty much it was working perfectly, but for some reason under Big Sur, it's decided that this isn't accessible. It doesn't actually stop you from doing anything, and everything will still compile, because it's just this getting upset about things. But yeah, so what I've done just do make is okay. So it isn't going to do anything because it's already built. I think it's got it all compiling, and everything you need is included in the repository, apart from the tools to build, and the tools to build are the standard tools. If you're using Mac, you have to build it from scratch. It's not much fun, but yeah, it works. The other thing that I've done is I have built myself a copy of PPSSPP. I don't know how you actually say that. I built two different versions. I built the STL version and the Qt version. Qt version is nice, that's the one I'm currently using. So what we can now do is reference the actual PPSSPP to Qt executable, which is part of the app package, and then pass it the eboot that we just generated. And basically, this is our Tetris game, and it properly works. Previous versions I had in my repository ran it a little bit too fast. there does seem to be a little bit of an issue with rendering the fonts. I'm not entirely sure why. I think when you run it on a native device, you don't see the flickering in quite the same way. But to be honest, I'm not 100% sure. This is definitely a work in progress, and so it's no way finished. And I'm not claiming that it's absolutely bulletproof, but it works well enough to write this game. And as you can see, it plays pretty well. It's a standard game of Tetris. It's not very exciting. I think I should get a few lines there. But what I plan to do is, as I said, there's a Snake game that's part of the DNA.NET Anywhere framework, distributable, that I'm going to port across and get that to work, because that's going to be quite simple. And I think the API for that would expand some of the things that I've already done, because it's got things like textures and stuff on some of the shapes. And the other thing that I plan to do is I plan to take some of the other games from TinyC and port those across as well, because I think they will be quite easy to port and would sort of give me the additional push to do some of the functionality, such as, you know, proper bitmaps and or image rendering and such. And because at the moment we're stuck with SDL as the main renderer, we can probably port them quite easily, because it's going to be a like-for-like, identical version of every routine. Whether or not this then pans out when I try and port the graphics routines properly to PSP, actual native routines, I don't know. But we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But yeah, I mean, this is essentially what I have been doing recently. It said works pretty well. Like I said, that I think there are some weird bugs, weird rendering issues with some of the stuff that it's doing. But essentially, I'm hoping to iron those out and get everything a little bit more stable. But as it goes, you can effectively have this DNA app running on your PSP and it will play one game. Plan in the future is probably to make it so that you can pick a game out of a number on the file system, and potentially to also allow people to package specific things and run them, so that you could package up a game with a runtime and run it separately as a separate entity. But we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But yeah, that's it, and thank you for your